Hello and peace upon those who love the night's quiet stories. Imagine a city not planted by rivers alone, nor built by armies, nor lifted by ancient kings, but summoned instead by the hunger of the human mind. A city without natural fortresses, without mountain walls, without a throne of marble to guarantee its survival. A city that by any strict logic should never have become the heart of a world. And yet, for a brief luminous age, it gathered the wisdom of continents and made knowledge itself a form of power. This is the story of Baghdad in the Islamic Golden Age of scholars who mapped the heavens by candlelight, of translators who resurrected forgotten worlds, of caliphs who believed that ideas could steady empires, and of the silent risks that come when brilliance gathers in one place. How did a desert empire craft the most advanced intellectual center of the early medieval world, who carried mathematics, medicine, and philosophy across borders like contraband treasures? Why did Baghdad become a beacon of reason, and what shadows formed behind its radiance? Here we will move through an age shaped by curiosity, uncertainty, ambition, and the fragile threads of human memory. Through astronomy, politics, poetry, architecture, and the long night labor of those who wrote, so the future would not forget. But before we begin, take a slow breath. Let the dust settle, let the torches dim, let your mind loosen from the present. Now, follow the river's dark surface as it bends toward a city of domes and minarets. Hear the murmur of scholars in courtyards scented with ink and crushed herbs, and step quietly into the 8th century, where the winds of history shift like parchment beneath a scribe's hand. The circle of foundations. Baghdad began not as a dream of power, but as a deliberate design for order. The Abbasid Caliph Al-Mansur sought more than a capital. He wanted a city that could mirror the symmetry of the heavens. The stakes were immense. The empire stretched from the Atlantic coast to the edges of Central Asia, its tribes uneasy, its governors distant, its scholars scattered like unbound leaves. Without a center capable of holding them together, the caliphate risked dissolving into rival principalities. Al-Mansur believed architecture could bind what politics could not. He summoned engineers from Persia, mathematicians from Kufa, surveyors who read land the way others read scripture. They proposed something rare for the medieval world, a city conceived entirely on paper before a single stone was laid. A circle perfect, enclosed, almost ritual in its geometry. A circle wide enough to hold an empire's pride, yet precise enough to speak the language of mathematics and power. This design was innovative because it made the ruler the fixed center of governance, a single point from which all authority radiated outward like spokes in a celestial wheel. Laborers dug foundations in the summer heat. Brickmakers fed kilns day and night. Transport caravans rolled in with cedar beams and Persian stone. And through it all, Baghdad grew as if rising from geometry itself, clean, calculated, and astonishingly modern in its planning. In its heart stood the caliph's palace, the Golden Gate, its walls polished to reflect sunlight in a shimmer that unsettled foreign envoys. Yet behind the grandeur, another layer of purpose emerged. Baghdad would not only command the empire, it would collect its knowledge. Night after night, as guards patrolled the ramparts, scribes catalogued scrolls arriving from Alexandria, Harran, Gundashapur. Al-Mansur understood a truth rare among rulers. Power built on force is brittle. Power built on learning endures. And thus the foundations of Baghdad held not just brick and mortar, but the early stirrings of an intellectual world the West would one day rediscover. The caravan of ideas. Every great turning of history begins with movement, not of armies this time, but of books. Caravans crossing the desert brought goods familiar to trade routes, silk, spices, amber, cinnamon, wine. But hidden among these crates were objects of far greater consequence: Greek manuscripts rescued from ruined temples, Persian treatises on astronomy, Indian works on mathematics, Syriac translations safeguarded by generations of monks. The political stakes were subtle yet immense. The Abbasids needed unity, something deeper than allegiance, more enduring than family bonds, stronger than the shifting loyalties of merchants and generals. Ideas could do what armies could not. They could shape identities. They could elevate a capital above mere geography. Scholars, some devout, some skeptical, all restless, made their way toward Baghdad in those years. Persian physicians seeking patronage, Nestorian Christian translators fleeing persecution, Jewish astronomers searching for new patrons, Muslim theologians who hoped to reconcile reason with revelation. In Baghdad they found something unprecedented, a government willing to pay them simply to think. Their workshops smelled of lamp oil and glue. Reeds cracked as scribes cut them for pens, ink pots dried and were refilled at dawn. The practice of translation became a science of its own. Greek into Syriac, Syriac into Arabic. Each step an act of preservation, each decision of vocabulary shaping the future. It was innovative not only because it saved ancient knowledge, but because it transformed Arabic into the most precise, scientific language of its age. Algebra, chemistry, philosophy, medicine all acquired new depth as translators debated meaning late into the night. In those lamplit rooms, Baghdad whispered to the world, "Let every idea, every puzzle, every fragment of forgotten wisdom come here." And the world obeyed. The House of Wisdom. The center of this intellectual tide was not a palace, but a library, unlike anything that had existed since Alexandria. Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, a name that carried both humility and ambition. From the outside it seemed modest, a complex of halls, courtyards and gardens, where pigeons cooed on warm rooftops and scribes drifted through colonnades with paper bundles pressed to their chests. Inside, however, it held the accumulated mind of civilizations, rows of manuscripts wrapped in silk, astrolabes crafted with abnormal precision, tables built wide enough to accommodate astronomical charts the length of carpets. The stakes grew sharper here. Knowledge no longer simply preserved the past, it began to challenge it. Astronomers recalculated planetary motions. Physicians compared Greek theories with Persian practice. Geographers redrew maps using observations from travelers and merchants. Mathematicians experimented with new forms of calculation that future scholars would call algebra. Human figures stepped forward in this environment, al-Khwarizmi, quiet, methodical, creating mathematical tools the world still uses, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, whose translation shaped medicine for a millennium, al-Kindi, philosopher of balance and proportion. Their work was innovative not merely for its brilliance, but because it operated under a principle rare in the medieval world. Knowledge was a shared asset, not a guarded secret. Scholars debated in courtyards cooled by fountains. Clerics listened, sometimes wary, sometimes fascinated. Young students copied diagrams until their hands cramped. And above it all, Baghdad breathed differently, as if the city itself had discovered a rhythm that came from thought, not conquest. Yet in the corners of the House of Wisdom, where shadows pooled beneath shelves of manuscripts, a different truth lingered. Brilliance is delicate, and golden ages, by their nature, are brief. The observatory above the city dawn settled over Baghdad with a softness that seemed almost ceremonial. The first rays touched the domes, then slipped down the city's arc of walls and finally reached a structure slightly apart from the bustle, a cylindrical tower rising above the rooftops like a quiet sentinel. The observatory, the lens through which Baghdad studied the heavens. A single declarative truth shaped this new phase of the city's ascent. If knowledge was to guide the empire, it must first understand the sky that guided time itself. The stakes were practical, yet profound. The empire needed accurate calendars for harvests, precise prayer times for the devout and reliable star tables for caravans that crossed the desert by night. But beneath these needs lay a deeper aspiration to bring order to a universe that seemed ruled by uncertainty. Astronomers climbed the spiral staircase before sunrise, their robes brushing against stone still cool from the night air. From the tower's platform they observed the last visible stars as they slipped behind the light of morning. Here, human stories gained clarity. Al-Farghani, methodical and austere, calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable precision. Al-Marwazi corrected inherited star charts with patient determination. And most notably, Yahya ibn Abi Mansur, chief astronomer, supervised measurements that would anchor new mathematical models. Their instruments, quadrants, armillary spheres, framed astrolabes were more advanced than any in Europe of the age. The observatory itself became a symbol of Baghdad's most innovative idea. Science could be a public pursuit sanctioned and funded by the state, yet driven by the curiosity of individuals. Night after night, amid the whisper of wind against the tower's parapets, Baghdad's astronomers charted motions they believed revealed divine order, not contradicting faith, but dignifying the complexity of creation. And with every new calculation, the city shaped its own destiny with the patience of a scribe, copying the sky onto parchment. The court of caliphs and scholars. If the observatory aimed for the heavens, the caliphal court wrestled with the shifting terrain of earthly power. Baghdad, in the age of Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'mun, balanced itself on a delicate thread between political tension and intellectual ambition. A framing truth remained: unavoidable ideas only flourish when rulers permit them and when they themselves seek illumination. The stakes now turned political. Governors in distant provinces eyed independence. Turkic military elites grew influential. Tribal loyalties strained the unity of the empire. Harun's court shimmered with ceremony courtiers in silks, trimmed with gold thread. Scribes kneeling with scrolls, musicians playing quiet melodies meant to ease the caliph's mind. But beneath the refinement lived questions of survival. Could Baghdad remain the axis of an empire so vast? Could its scholars influence policy rather than merely entertain curiosity? In these halls, human stories intertwined with statecraft. Judges debated ethical reforms. Theologians argued over the interpretation of scripture. Philosophers introduced Greek logic to ministers wary of foreign influence. Harun favored learning but feared controversy. He sought stability above all. So ideas entered the court softly, dressed in metaphor and commentary. His son al-Ma'mun would be different. Braver intellectually, more restless, more willing to reshape foundations. He dreamed not merely of ruling the empire, but of ruling its mind. And so the court, once a place where poetry softened politics, began shifting toward a new identity, a laboratory for governance inspired by reason. What was innovative here was subtle but transformative. The caliphate began to treat scholarship as a pillar of legitimacy, a way to govern not just bodies, but thought. This alignment of power and learning would bring Baghdad to its greatest heights, and later its most perilous crossroads, the translator's dilemma. Inside the House of Wisdom workshops filled with a soft, constant rustle, the sound of parchment turning of pens, scraping impatient strokes of scholars murmuring in Syriac, Greek, Persian, and Arabic as they wrestled with ideas older than empires. A new tension now shaped the intellectual climate. How far could Baghdad reach into the past without unsettling its own future? Translation was no longer a simple act of preservation. It became a negotiation between worlds. The stakes were philosophical and theological. Aristotle's logic challenged existing religious schools. Galen's medicine questioned inherited assumptions about the body. Indian mathematics introduced concepts that required new vocabulary. Scholars stood at the edge of a vast ocean of knowledge, and each manuscript carried waves that washed against familiar shores. Human agents emerged with distinct voices. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, tireless and meticulous, translating medical texts with a loyalty to meaning rather than wording. Thabit ibn Qurra, mastering Greek numerical systems and reshaping them for Arabic scholars. Al-Kindi, philosopher of harmonies, who argued passionately that reason was not a threat to revelation, but a tool given by the Creator to understand his world. Yet for every breakthrough there were whispers of resistance. Some clerics feared that Greek metaphysics would erode moral foundations. Some ministers worried that too much questioning would weaken obedience. Some scribes grumbled that foreign terms polluted the purity of Arabic. This friction itself became a sign of innovation. For the first time in medieval history, a capital city openly debated how knowledge should be used, who should control it, and what it meant for the identity of its people. In lamplit chambers, where shelves towered like silent witnesses, translators weighed each word with the gravity of diplomats. Their choices shaped future sciences, future languages, future civilizations. Baghdad breathed through their pens. And yet each evening, as lamps flickered and shadows lengthened, a quiet unease crept into the air, for the Caliph Al-Ma'mun was about to change the balance of power between reason and faith. The dream of Al-Ma'mun. When Al-Ma'mun ascended the throne, Baghdad felt the shift almost instantly. His mind, sharp and insistent, moved faster than his court could follow. He walked the palace gardens at night, a lamp in hand, pondering questions that pulled him toward a remarkable idea. What if the empire could be governed by truth itself, not by tradition, not by lineage, not by fear, but by clarity, reasoned, examined, debated clarity? The stakes were existential, not merely administrative. Al-Ma'mun believed the empire would fracture unless its people shared a unified intellectual framework. This was not only political calculation, it was conviction. He invited philosophers to dine with him. He studied logic until dawn. He demanded astronomical observations to refine the calendar. He funded translations with sums that startled even wealthy donors. And then came the moment that would shape his reign, the dream he claimed to see of Aristotle, standing before him in calm serenity, encouraging him to lift reason to a throne beside faith. Human agents reacted in their own ways. Scholars rejoiced, believing a new age of inquiry had arrived. Traditionalists grew wary, sensing a shift that might unsettle established schools. Politicians whispered, calculating how this new intellectual fervor might alter their influence. Al-Ma'mun pressed forward undeterred. What made his rule innovative was unprecedented. In the medieval world, he promoted the idea that rational inquiry was not merely allowed, but necessary for a just society. In Baghdad, the night air seemed to vibrate differently. Towers glowed with lamplight far past sunset. Students debated beneath colonnades until exhaustion pulled them apart. Ideas had become the empire's pulse, and Baghdad, luminous and watchful, found itself poised between enlightenment and tension, between the calm of knowledge and the storms that knowledge often invites. The Inquisition of ideas. Baghdad entered a new and delicate chapter. The air, once light with scholarly enthusiasm, now carried a faint tension like parchment stretched too tightly on a scribe's frame. For a single truth now governed the heart of the empire. Al-Ma'mun intended to test the boundaries of belief itself. The Caliph, convinced that reason was the proper instrument of divine understanding, began what later scholars would call the Mihna, a tribunal of doctrine, a formal interrogation of thought. The stakes were unprecedented. Never before had an Islamic state sought to enforce not only outward obedience, but the inward conclusions of the mind. Judges, theologians, and scholars were summoned to affirm a specific position on Scripture, a stance that aligned with rationalist theology and with Al-Ma'mun's dream of a united intellectual empire. Some complied uneasy but obedient. Others resisted, believing that state interference in theology threatened the independence of the religious tradition. In the streets, whispering grew. Was Baghdad still the sanctuary of free inquiry it had been? Or had the brilliance of its scholars drawn the eye of power too closely? Human agents, once secure in their academic pursuits, now found themselves confronting choices of conscience. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, steadfast and unyielding, refused the caliph's demand and endured imprisonment. Judges trembled as they weighed personal safety against integrity. Scholars struggled to balance loyalty to the caliph with loyalty to their principles. Yet even in this fraught moment, Baghdad continued to innovate in a way both paradoxical and remarkable. The city's intellectual debates became part of public life, woven into sermons, legal decisions, and the rhythms of daily conversation. The Mihna did not silence Baghdad, it sharpened it. It forced the city to ask what knowledge truly meant, and who had the right to define it. Each evening, as lamps glowed behind latticed windows, a question hovered over the domes of the capital. Could an empire built on reason survive the weight of enforcing it? The scholars of medicine and the body. While theology trembled under scrutiny, another field of study continued its quiet, relentless advanced medicine. In the teaching hospitals of Baghdad, precursors to modern institutions, a different kind of inquiry unfolded, one that dealt not in doctrine, but in the fragile substance of human life. The framing truth here was grounded and clear. Baghdad believed the body could be understood and therefore healed. The stakes were deeply human. Plague stalked the empire in unpredictable cycles. Fevers swept through markets. Injuries from construction, trade, and war demanded skilled care. Physicians in Baghdad approached these challenges with methods rare in the medieval world. They trained through apprenticeship and instruction. They kept case notes. They debated the merits of various treatments. Some even conducted controlled experiments to test medical theories inherited from Greece and Persia. Human agents carried the torch of innovation. Al-Razi, compassionate and unorthodox, distinguished between smallpox and measles with clarity unmatched for centuries. Sabur ibn Sahal, author of one of the earliest medical formularies, catalogued treatments in a systemized, accessible manner. Yohanna ibn Masawai, stoic and sharp-tongued, taught generations of physicians how to balance humoral theory with empirical observation. Inside Baghdad's hospitals, rows of beds lined airy halls, cooled by courtyards and fountains. The scent of herbs mingled with the faint sharpness of vinegar used to clean instruments. Patients from all walks of life arrived: traders, soldiers, laborers, scholars, and found care delivered not by spiritual ritual but by practical, reasoned craft. The innovation that defined these institutions was striking. Medicine in Baghdad was treated as a public service, funded by endowments and accessible regardless of status. Amid this dedication to healing, a quiet philosophical insight took shape. If the body could be studied, so could the mind. If illness had patterns, so might knowledge. And thus medicine became another lens through which Baghdad examined the nature of human existence, not only how people lived, but why they suffered and what it meant to care for one another in an age of ambition. The cartographers of the known world beyond hospitals and courtrooms. Baghdad's scholars widened their gaze to the world itself. For an empire spanning deserts, mountains, and deep river valleys, knowledge of geography became not only a curiosity, but a powerful instrument of governance. The declarative truth of this new chapter was clear: the world could be mapped, measured, annotated, brought into conceptual order. The stakes were imperial. Accurate maps guided trade routes, helped governors manage distant provinces, and informed military strategy. Merchants needed to know which roads were safe, which ports thrived, which regions grew grain, dates, or cotton. Under Al-Ma'mun, teams of geographers and mathematicians undertook surveys unparalleled in their scale. Using astronomical calculations, they measured degrees of longitude and latitude with precision rare for the age. Human figures again illuminated the endeavor. Al-Khwarizmi, already renowned for his innovations in mathematics, composed a book of the image of the Earth, a compilation of geographic knowledge from India, Persia, Byzantium, and beyond. Al-Balkhi, contemplative and philosophical, produced regional maps that blended observation with literary insight. Ibn Khordad Bey Rai and Worldly documented trade networks and postal routes with an administrator's clarity. Maps in Baghdad were not solely practical tools, they were works of intellectual artistry. Colored inks marked mountain ranges, rivers coiled like living threads across parchment, and marginal notes explained winds, climates, and customs. The innovation lay in synthesis. Baghdad combined empirical measurement with inherited knowledge, correcting errors and creating a unified view of the world at a time when most societies still saw geography through mythological lenses. These maps reshaped more than trade. They reshaped imagination. They allowed scholars to conceive of distant lands as part of a connected whole, a single world whose vastness could be known, measured, perhaps even understood. And with each careful stroke of their reed pens, Baghdad's cartographers expanded not only the boundaries of the empire, but the boundaries of medieval thought, the poets of the court and the street. Even as science advanced and politics tightened, Baghdad's cultural soul beat strongest in its poetry. Poetry in this age was not ornament, it was identity. A shared language in a diverse empire. A bridge between intellect and emotion. It framed public celebrations, softened diplomatic disputes, and whispered through private gatherings where courtiers leaned close to catch the rhythm of a skilled reciter. A foundational truth guided this era in Baghdad poetry carried the weight of memory. The stakes were social and moral. Poets shaped reputations. They preserved history. They challenged excess and praised generosity. Human voices rose from the city's varied quarters, Abu Nuwas, provocative and brilliant, whose verses captured the city's decadence with daring humor. Al-Baturi refined and lyrical, weaving images of nature that soothed a restless age. Al-Mutanabi, proud and towering, whose lines encapsulated ambition, virtue, and the fragility of power. In the caliphal court, poetry could elevate a ruler's prestige or caution him against vanity. In the markets, verses traveled faster than rumors. Scribes copied them for eager buyers, and young students memorized them as easily as breathing. What made Baghdad's poetic culture innovative was its fusion, Persian imagery, Arabic rhythm, and diverse urban experience blended into a literary tradition unmatched in richness and emotional depth. Poetry did what politics could not. It united, it consoled, it taught. And in its quiet moments, as reciters performed in candlelit rooms where shadows swayed against plaster walls, poetry reminded Baghdad of something essential, that even in an age of reason, the human heart required language shaped by beauty, not calculation. In those lines of verse, the city revealed its tenderness, a counterbalance to its ambition, a refuge from its tensions, a whisper of its enduring soul. The mechanics of invention. Baghdad's brilliance did not remain confined to parchment and theory. In workshops filled with the metallic scent of brass filings and the steady rhythm of artisans at work, the city began shaping the physical tools of its intellectual age. A single framing truth guided this evolution: ideas gain power only when transformed into instruments that change daily life. The stakes were practical and visionary. Astronomers needed more precise devices. Engineers required better methods for irrigation and measurement. Administrators sought tools to expand the infrastructure of a sprawling empire. Workshops near the House of Wisdom buzzed with controlled purpose. Artisans hammered delicate gears, filed grooves into astrolabes, and assembled mechanical devices so intricate they seemed almost alive. Human agents stood at the front of this movement. Abbas ibn Firnas, curious and daring, experimented with lenses and attempted flight with wings of silk and wood. Banu Musa, three brothers, Muhammad Ahmad and Al-Hassan, whose inventions ranged from hydraulic mechanisms to automata, capable of pouring water or playing musical phrases. Al-Jazari would come later, but the foundations of his mechanical genius were laid in these very years in workshops where artisans refined the vocabulary of gears and pistons. The innovation of these inventors lay not merely in their mechanical skill, but in their philosophy. They integrated mathematics, geometry, and physics into engineering, treating machines as embodiments of scientific principles. Baghdad's mills ground grain by water channels designed with mathematical precision. Clocks tracked the hours of prayer with silent regularity. Astrolabes grew so complex that travelers marveled at how a disk of brass could reveal the heavens. At night, when torches flickered across colonnades, students studied these devices, tracing patterns with their fingers as if touching the hidden gears of the universe itself. And slowly the city realized something extraordinary. Baghdad was not merely observing nature, it was beginning to replicate its logic. The calculators and the new mathematics. While inventors refined the physical world, mathematicians pushed deeper into the abstract. Their aim was quiet but audacious: to discover the structures underlying all things numbers, motion, space, logic. The stakes now extended across the empire. Taxation required more accurate accounting. Architecture demanded new systems of proportion. Astronomy needed models that matched observation. And commerce, ever expanding, required calculations that could accommodate large and complex quantities. In rooms lined with geometric diagrams, mathematicians debated with calm intensity. Ink stained their fingertips. Loose pages filled with equations drifted across tables like fallen leaves. Human agents shaped the era. Al-Khwarizmi measured, and methodical introduced algebra as a discipline separate from geometry, allowing problems to be solved symbolically rather than visually. Ibn Qurra, brilliant and restless, translated Greek works while developing new theories in number science. Al-Karaji, forward-thinking, began exploring algebraic operations independent of geometry, anticipating methods that would echo in later centuries. Their innovations transformed more than mathematics, they transformed mentality. For the first time in medieval history, numbers became tools of prediction, not merely record-keeping. Astronomers could model celestial movements. Architects could calculate load-bearing arches before building them. Merchants could track inventories with unprecedented accuracy. In Baghdad's classrooms, open courtyards cooled by shade awnings, teachers demonstrated equations with smooth stones, showing students how quantities could change even when the objects themselves remained unseen. This subtle transformation reshaped Baghdad's understanding of reality. It taught the city to see the world not only as it appeared, but as it could be described, refined, and predicted through logic. Numbers became the quiet instruments of empire, and Baghdad became the place where they acquired a new precision, the readers of hidden texts. Even as mathematics took flight, a quieter and more fragile pursuit unfolded in the dim corners of Baghdad's libraries. A simple declaration defined this chapter: some knowledge survives only through the devotion of those who guard it. The stakes were archival and existential. Manuscripts rescued from Alexandria and Antioch were often damaged, incomplete, or corrupted by time. Scrolls from Persia bore worm-eaten edges. Greek treatises arrived in fragments, their meaning obscured by centuries of neglect. In these dim rooms, where dust hung in the air like fine gold and scrolls lay wrapped in linen, scribes undertook the painstaking art of reconstruction. Human agents emerged as guardians of memory. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, already renowned for his translations, compared multiple manuscripts line by line to correct errors introduced over generations. Ishaq ibn Hunayn, his son, continued the work with equal devotion, often rewriting entire sections to restore clarity or precision. Qusta ibn Luqa, a physician-philosopher, traveled widely to acquire additional manuscripts, carrying them home in saddlebags that bore the wear of desert journeys. Their rooms glowed with the soft light of oil lamps. Stones held down the edges of parchment. Ink recipes were guarded like jewels, for a poorly mixed ink could fade within a decade. The innovative principle behind this scholarly labor was both simple and revolutionary. Knowledge was not static, it required preservation through active critical engagement. Scribes annotated margins with cautious commentary. They compared variant manuscripts. They established terminology that would later guide generations of scholars. In the silence of these rooms, Baghdad's intellectual world expanded inward, not through discovery, but through faithful reconstruction. And in doing so, the city created an unbroken chain of knowledge linking ancient civilizations to future ones that had yet to imagine the inheritance they would receive. The whisper of philosophy. With texts restored and ideas flowing freely, Baghdad turned toward the most delicate of pursuits, philosophy, a field where inquiry was both liberating and dangerous. A framing truth shaped this intellectual terrain. Philosophy sought to explore questions that neither science nor scripture could fully resolve. The stakes were intellectual and spiritual. Philosophers attempted bold syntheses that reinterpreted creation ethics and metaphysics. Their arguments reached the ears of theologians, some intrigued, others wary. Debates spilled from academies into public squares. Human agents shaped the philosophical horizon. Al-Kindi, calm and analytical, argued that truth was a unity accessible through reason, revelation, and experience. Al-Farabi, quiet and meticulous, explored the nature of society, envisioning a virtuous city ruled by wisdom rather than lineage. Ibn Sina, whose youth overlapped the later Abbasid world, studied Baghdad's texts and would later integrate them into a grand, philosophical medical system. In Baghdad's evenings, colonnades echoed with debates on causation, the structure of the soul, and the logic of the natural world. Students listened with steady attention, their thoughts unfolding like leaves in warm light. What made philosophy innovative in this era was its tone. It did not challenge faith. It sought to harmonize it with reason, to show that inquiry could strengthen belief by revealing the intricacy of creation. This quiet negotiation between intellect and spirituality gave Baghdad a dimension unique in its age. It was a city where the mind could roam widely without detaching from the sacred, where questions were not feared, but refined through careful reflection. Philosophy brought a calm melancholy to the era, a sense that knowledge was vast yet finite, that human understanding touched only a fraction of the order that governed the cosmos. And in this gentle hum of contemplation, Baghdad entered its most introspective phase, a period where wisdom deepened even as the world beyond its walls grew restless. Echoes in the colonnades. As inventions hummed, as mathematics reshaped thought, as manuscripts blossomed with restored clarity, and as philosophy harmonized reason with faith, Baghdad's nights grew stiller, as if the city paused to listen to the quiet engine of its own mind. Students walked slowly along marble colonnades, hands clasped behind their backs, reciting new principles under their breath. Scribes extinguished lamps one by one, leaving faint trails of smoke curling upward like unspoken questions. And on the rooftops, astronomers adjusted their instruments, watching the stars shift through the immense quiet of the desert sky. Baghdad had become a place where the world felt measurable, knowable, molded by human thought. Yet beneath this serene intellectual glow, the first tremors of future uncertainty began to ripple, subtle, restrained, almost inaudible. For no city, however brilliant, stands immune to the shifting winds of power, nor to the currents of ambition that flow beyond its walls. The fracturing horizon. Baghdad's brilliance still glowed, but the light now cast longer, thinner shadows, the kind that appear when a sun begins its slow descent. A simple framing truth guided this new chapter. An empire can cultivate genius for a time, but it cannot escape the gravity of its own politics. The stakes were structural and urgent. Vast territories strained against central rule. Provincial governors accumulated wealth and soldiers. Nomadic groups shifted along the empire's borders. New powers rose quietly in the east and west. In Baghdad itself, the caliphal palace still shimmered under polished marble, but its corridors now carried a quieter, more anxious rhythm. Servants hushed their voices, ministers met in smaller circles, reports arrived from distant provinces telling of defiance, shortages, and unrest. The Abbasid caliphs, once secure in the center of their circular city, found the lines of authority bending like reeds in the wind. Human agents embodied this tension. Al-Mu'tasim, stern and pragmatic, reorganized the army, with Turkish soldiers loyal to him personally. Regional commanders, empowered by distance, began making decisions once reserved for the capital. Administrators, wearied by endless reforms, struggled to enforce taxation across borders that seemed to shift each year. This political shift reshaped the intellectual atmosphere. Scholars sensed that the court's gaze was drifting away from study and toward the necessities of control. Yet innovation persisted in unexpected corners. The empire began experimenting with new administrative models, balancing central authority with regional autonomy, a governance strategy centuries ahead of its time. Still, for all its ingenuity, Baghdad felt the beginning of a long, subtle unraveling. The air no longer carried the buoyancy of pure ambition, it held the weight of vigilance. And under the domes where debate had once flowed freely, scholars whispered of a world growing larger than the capital that once held it together. The rise of new powers, beyond the Tigris, in lands of river plains and mountain passes, new centers of influence stirred. Baghdad, for all its splendor, could not be everywhere. It could not answer every border incursion, settle every tribal dispute. or suppress every provincial ambition. A clear truth defined this shift power once shared widely rarely returns unchanged. The stakes were geopolitical. The empire's reach had been its strength, but now its size threatened to pull it apart. In Egypt, commanders grew assertive, using their control of grain shipments to negotiate terms with the caliphate. In Persia, mountain fortresses hosted new dynasties that recognized the caliph in name but followed their own policies in practice. Across the Caucasus, new alliances hardened, drawing strength from local traditions and unfamiliar languages. Human figures once peripheral now commanded attention. Ibn Tulun, formidable in Egypt, established a semi-independent rule that displayed both administrative skill and quiet defiance. The Safarids in the east, forged from humble origins, wielded military strength with startling discipline. The Tahirids, pragmatic and shrewd, balanced loyalty to Baghdad with autonomy, at home guiding the empire toward decentralized governance. In each region, innovation emerged through necessity. Local rulers adapted Persian bureaucracy, combined Arab military organization with new tactics, and introduced tax systems tailored to their landscapes. For Baghdad, this decentralization brought a paradox. It preserved the empire's broader stability but weakened its unity. The House of Wisdom continued to flourish, but caravans now traveled under flags not wholly Abbasid, and scholars occasionally paused, wondering how long the center could hold while its edges developed minds and ambitions of their own. The turbulence within the walls. Inside Baghdad itself, a quieter storm gathered, one born not of distant provinces, but of the city's own evolving heart. The framing truth was sobering. The guardians of the empire were beginning to reshape it. Al-Mutasim had reorganized the army, relying heavily on Turkish soldiers trained in disciplined ranks and loyal to their commanders, rather than the old tribal factions. The stakes were immediate and intimate. The palace guards now spoke unfamiliar languages. Their customs differed from those of the city they patrolled. Their presence altered the tone of Baghdad's streets, more stern, more watchful, more detached. These new military elites quickly rose in influence. Their commanders advised the caliph, their units controlled the barracks. Their loyalty became indispensable and therefore powerful. Human agents embodied the city's changing dynamic. Ashinas, a commander, whose discipline earned both respect and unease, became a figure of immense authority. Itak, skilled and strategic, managed logistics with precision, expanding the army's reach. Wasif, young and ambitious, navigated the shifting loyalties of soldiers who came from far beyond the empire's heartland. The innovation here was paradoxical. Baghdad was pioneering a professional military, unburdened by tribal allegiance, a model that would influence future empires, yet the very success of this system shifted power away from the caliphate. Within the city, the tone changed subtly. Merchants still sold spices beneath shaded awnings. Poets still performed in gardens scented with jasmine. Scholars still debated beneath cool colonnades. But people walked faster, looked over their shoulders more often, spoke in lowered voices about the growing authority of the military. Baghdad remained brilliant, but the street lamps now glowed against an undercurrent of unease. The decline of central confidence. As years passed, a new challenge emerged, one quieter than rebellion, but no less dangerous: the erosion of trust in central governance. Baghdad had once been the unquestioned axis around which the empire turned. Now its influence felt thinner, its commands slower to inspire obedience. A foundational truth governed this shift: when confidence fades, even stable systems begin to falter. The stakes were psychological and administrative. Tax collectors hesitated in distant provinces. Merchants wondered whether Baghdad could guarantee safe trade. Scholars speculated privately about the future of institutions they cherished. Fiscal challenges compounded the uncertainty. The cost of employing the new army increased. Caravan trade faced disruptions from rival powers. Irrigation canals required constant repair that the treasury could no longer fully fund. Human figures at the administrative center struggled. Viziers, once confident architects of policy, now navigated competing interests to keep essential institutions afloat. Scribes, meticulous and overworked, drafted new regulations to stabilize revenue, often to little effect. Judges burdened by growing caseloads attempted to maintain order amid disputes that reflected the city's changing identity. Still, Baghdad's intellectual life endured a testament to the resilience of minds shaped by generations of study. In the House of Wisdom, scholars continued to work. Astronomers refined their calculations, philosophers debated the nature of causality, physicians wrote case notes with the same careful calm as before. But even here the atmosphere shifted slightly, a growing awareness that knowledge alone could not shield a civilization from the pressures accumulating beyond its walls. The quiet dimming of an age. As markets closed at dusk and the call to prayer echoed across rooftops, Baghdad felt both luminous and fragile, a lantern burning steadily, yet aware of the gathering wind. The city remained magnificent, still filled with scholars and poets, still echoing with debates that blended reason, faith, and imagination. But beneath the glow of torches, an unspoken melancholy settled golden ages do not announce their endpoints. They fade, gradually, almost tenderly, as if reluctant to leave the people who cherished them. Students continued to study late into the night, reciting principles beneath the cool stillness of colonnades. Artisans polished astrolabes that gleamed like small suns. Scholars dipped pens into ink to preserve what they feared might one day be lost. Baghdad was not falling, not yet. Its life was too rich, its mind too vast. But the tremors had begun, and in the quiet intervals between thought and rest, one could sense the city preparing not for collapse but for change. A new chapter approached one, shaped by resilience, adaptation, and endurance, the qualities that define civilizations as surely as their golden ages do. The age of competing court. Baghdad did not collapse into darkness. Instead, it entered a long, wandering twilight, a period in which brilliance and uncertainty wove themselves together like strands of silk and smoke. A single framing truth defined the era when central authority weakens, the outskirts learn to rule themselves. The stakes were political and cultural, not destruction, but diffusion, not silence, but a growing chorus of rival voices. Across the vastness of the former empire, new courts emerged, glimmering like distant constellations. Samarra, the glittering military capital. Nishapur, cradle of Persian scholarship. Rai, bustling and semi-independent. Cordoba in Al-Andalus, bold and ambitious in the far west. Each formed its own intellectual identity, borrowing from Baghdad but shaping the inheritance anew. Human agents rose to prominence in these shifting landscapes. The Samanids of Central Asia, patrons of Persian literature and science whose courts produced poets that future centuries would revere. The Buyids, tactically brilliant, who gradually took control of Baghdad itself while maintaining the symbolic authority of the Caliph. The Fatimids in North Africa, building their own system of libraries, academies, and theological schools. Yet even as these courts blossomed, each one owed an unspoken debt to the intellectual foundations Baghdad had laid. What made this period innovative was the spread, not the decline of knowledge. Baghdad's scholarly culture became a template copied and adapted across the Islamic world, ensuring that learning survived even as political unity faltered. Inside Baghdad, this diffusion of authority cast a quiet shadow. The caliphate remained, but its embrace no longer held the empire firmly. Still, the city's scholars continued to work, aware that they were now part of a wider constellation of learning, a star whose light no longer stood alone, yet remained essential to the shape of the sky. The House of Wisdom under new masters. Within Baghdad's walls, the House of Wisdom persisted not untouched, but undiminished in purpose. A declarative truth guided its endurance: as long as scholars gather knowledge resists decline. The stakes were intellectual and psychological. Could the house remain a sanctuary when the political climate grew unpredictable? Could curiosity thrive when courts changed hands and priorities shifted like desert wind? The arrival of the Buyids, Persian military leaders, who effectively controlled the caliphate, brought new challenges and new opportunities. They favored Persian administrative traditions, supported scientists and philosophers, and allowed scholarly institutions to operate with surprising independence. Human figures anchored this transitional era. Al-Farabi, serene and introspective, arrived in Baghdad to study logic and political philosophy under teachers who bridged Greek and Islamic thought. Ibn al-Nadim, a bookseller with a restless mind, compiled his famous Fihrist, a catalogue of books, authors, translators, and scientific traditions, arguably one of the most ambitious literary surveys of the medieval world. Ibn Miskawayh, historian and ethicist, reflected on the moral arc of civilizations, his contemplative prose shaped by Baghdad's long view of empire. Scholars and copyists still crowded the great library halls. Students still gathered around mentors who used diagrams and treated parchments as living instruments of clarity. The innovation of this new phase was subtle but profound. The House of Wisdom learned to function not as an arm of the state, but as a self-sustaining intellectual community, adaptable, resilient, and less dependent on the caliph's patronage. In these years, Baghdad's scholars seemed older, as if bearing the memory of an age of assured brilliance. But their pens remained steady, their debates still patient, their ambitions tempered, yet unbroken. The markets of knowledge. If the House of Wisdom was the mind of Baghdad, its bustling streets were the bloodstream carrying ideas, goods, letters, and news through the arteries of the city. A framing truth defined this vibrant landscape. Commerce and knowledge in Baghdad were inseparable. The stakes were economic and cultural. Trade routes faltered in some regions, yet flourished in others, requiring constant negotiation and a deep understanding of geography and supply. Yet no matter the political turbulence, Baghdad's markets remained alive, overflowing with merchants from India, silk traders from China, carpet weavers from Persia, and spice dealers whose fragrances carried through the alleys. Amid this cacophony of voices and textures, booksellers held quiet authority. Human agents shaped this era of commercial knowledge. Ibn al-Nadim, whose shop became a crossroads for scholars, travelers, translators, and curious officials. Paper merchants, who imported fine sheets from Samarkand and supplied scribes with the material that had made Baghdad the capital of written knowledge. Calligraphers, artisans of quiet dignity whose steady hands transformed texts into objects of devotion and precision. The markets reflected Baghdad's resilience. Even as politics shifted, trade adapted. Even as military elites rose, the demand for books and learning persisted. What was innovative here was not a new invention, but a cultural phenomenon. Baghdad democratized access to knowledge by making books a commodity, not a privilege reserved for courts and temples. Travelers remarked that in Baghdad a man could buy a fine manuscript with the same ease as a bolt of Persian silk. Knowledge flowed through the markets as abundantly as water through the Tigris, a lifeline sustained not by rulers but by the habits and desires of everyday people. This broad base of literacy and curiosity ensured that Baghdad's intellect did not vanish with the fortunes of its palace. The maturing of philosophy. As dynasties shifted and military factions negotiated power, Baghdad's philosophers continued their pursuit with steady resolve. They felt the weight of history on their shoulders and the responsibility to interpret an age that no longer possessed the confident unity of the past. A framing truth guided their work. Philosophy matures not in certainty, but in the tension between knowledge and doubt. The stakes were moral and existential. How should a society act when authority becomes fragmented? What virtues sustain communities when political structures falter? What meaning can be found in the long cycles of rise and decline? Human agents embodied the reflective spirit of the age. Al-Farabi, in his late years, refined his vision of the virtuous city, exploring whether wisdom could flourish even when political power faltered. Ibn Miskawayh, gentle in manner yet piercing in thought, developed ethical treatises that drew from Greek philosophy, Persian wisdom literature, and Islamic moral traditions. The Brethren of Purity, an anonymous collective, composed encyclopedic epistles, blending mathematics, cosmology, ethics, and spirituality into a contemplative synthesis unlike anything else in the medieval world. The innovation that defined this era lay not in discovery, but in synthesis. Baghdad's philosophers wove together centuries of intellectual traditions, into a cohesive moral philosophy focused on human character balance and harmony. They walked beneath colonnades at dusk, their voices low, their reflections shaped by the quiet melancholy of a civilization aware of its own aging. Philosophy softened ambition, guided behavior, and offered a calm resilience as the city navigated its slowing golden glow. The city that refused to fade. Baghdad, in this twilight era, was not a fading star. It was a steady beacon illuminating itself with memory, creativity, and the stubborn refusal to surrender the life of the mind. At night, the Tigris shimmered as lanterns floated from balconies, their light trembling on the water like shifting constellations. Scholars carried satchels of manuscripts across stone bridges worn by generations of footsteps. Calligraphers closed their shutters after hours of steady work. Students sat in courtyards reviewing lessons by the dim glow of dying lamps. A quiet resilience shaped the city's rhythm. Baghdad no longer aimed to govern the world, it aimed to understand it. It no longer measured its worth by conquest, but by the endurance of thought. The Golden Age was no longer rising. It was lasting, softer, older, humbler, yet still alive. And in that sustained glow, Baghdad revealed something rare in history, that a civilization can continue to shine even as the forces around it shift, so long as its scholars remain at work and its people continue to believe in the quiet dignity of learning. The restless borders. As Baghdad settled into its long twilight, forces far beyond the Tigris began to stir with a new and unfamiliar intensity. A clear framing truth defined this next chapter. No civilization, however brilliant, can isolate itself from the tremors of the wider world. The stakes were no longer merely administrative or cultural, they were civilizational. Across the steppes of Central Asia, horsemen moved with the restless fluidity of wind-driven storms. Tribes displaced by harsher winters pressed toward the edges of great empires. Caravan routes shifted in response, pulling traders, scribes and rumors along with them. To the north, the lands beyond the Oxus boiled with uncertainty, kingdoms rising and falling in rapid succession, each sending emissaries and scouts toward the boundaries of the Islamic world. Human agents shaped these shifting horizons. The Oghuz Turks, ambitious and disciplined, sought new lands and alliances. Steppe confederations forged by necessity pushed southward as pastures shrank. Nomadic leaders, bold and calculating, recognized the wealth of Persia and Mesopotamia as both an opportunity and a temptation. Baghdad's geographers tracked these movements with increasing concern. Maps were updated, borders were redrawn. Reports arrived at the caliphal palace with a tone more urgent than before. And yet Baghdad itself felt strangely insulated, as if its domes and libraries could keep the storms at bay through the gravity of culture alone. But the world had begun to change, and the city could no longer ignore the distant thunder rolling across the steppes. The rise of the Seljuks. From the vast plains of Central Asia emerged a confederation destined to reshape the Islamic world. The Seljuks, a clan of Oghuz Turks whose discipline and adaptability set them apart from other nomadic groups. A framing truth guided their ascent. Military power can preserve a civilization, but only if it understands the civilization it protects. The stakes were geopolitical and intellectual. Would the Seljuks become destroyers or guardians? Would they threaten Baghdad or revive its authority? Under Tukhril Beg, pragmatic and astute, the Seljuks recognized something extraordinary. Baghdad's legitimacy was not merely political, it was spiritual, intellectual and cultural. The caliphate, though weakened, still held symbolic authority across the Islamic world, and so Tukhril marched not to conquer Baghdad but to stabilize it, to offer military protection in exchange for recognition. Human figures filled this transformative era. Tukhril Beg, precise in judgment, determined to restore order where others saw only fragmentation. Alp Arslan, fierce yet educated, guided by advisors who understood the delicate balance between force and culture. Nizam al-Mulk, a vizier of exceptional intellect, who devised administrative reforms that would shape Persian governance for centuries to come. The innovation of the Seljuk era lay in a remarkable synthesis nomadic military structure combined with Persian bureaucratic tradition, a fusion that granted new strength to an old and weary empire. In Baghdad, scholars observed the change cautiously. They saw soldiers in the streets, heard foreign tongues in the markets, felt the shift in political gravity. And yet, paradoxically, the Seljuk arrival brought stability, a chance for the caliphate to breathe again, if only for a moment. The revival of madrasa learning. Amid the Seljuk ascendancy, a new institution rose quietly beside mosques, markets, and gardens, an institution that would redefine education across the Islamic world, the madrasa. A simple framing. Truth described their purpose to cultivate a vast, coherent class of scholars, judges, and administrators who could sustain intellectual life regardless of political turbulence. The stakes were intellectual and social. Baghdad's elite scholars could no longer anchor the entire empire's education. Knowledge needed broader foundations, more teachers, more students, more structure. Under the guidance of Nizam al-Mulk, Seljuk vizier and master strategist madrasas were established in major cities, including the famed Nizamiya of Baghdad, a center of learning unparalleled in its design. Human agents brought the system to life. Al-Juwayni, a theologian of sharp insight, lectured before large crowds who traveled days to hear him. Al-Ghazali, who would later become one of the most influential thinkers in Islamic intellectual history, taught in Baghdad with a clarity that blended philosophy, theology, and ethical reflection. Administrators trained in this new system helped stabilize the empire through legal and bureaucratic expertise. Madrasas changed the rhythm of Baghdad. Students crowded narrow streets at dawn and dusk. Debates spilled into courtyards lined with carved wooden screens. Markets near the schools flourished with bookshops, ink merchants, and scribes offering their services. The innovation of the madrasa system was not merely organizational. It created a durable intellectual network, a tradition of learning independent of any single ruler, bound together by methods, texts, and shared values. While the House of Wisdom remained a beacon of specialized knowledge, the madrasas became the steady heartbeat of a society determined to preserve its intellectual identity. The philosophy of uncertainty. Even as stability returned, in part, Baghdad's scholars sensed that their world was entering a more introspective phase. A framing truth shaped their contemplation. In times of transition, philosophy becomes an anchor. The stakes were existential. Questions that once felt abstract now carried emotional weight. What held a civilization together when political unity frayed? What sustained faith when competing schools debated with sharpened arguments? What meaning could scholars find in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable? Human agents embodied these concerns. Al-Ghazali, who grappled with the tension between reason and revelation, ultimately seeking a harmony that acknowledged the limits of human intellect. Ibn Sina's legacy, which continued to influence philosophy and medicine even as scholars debated its implications. The theologians of Baghdad who sought clarity amid the complex intersection of politics, science, and belief. In quiet libraries where dust motes drifted through slanting light, philosophers transcribed their doubts with gentle resolve. Their manuscripts reflected a more spiritual tone, not abandoning reason, but integrating it with humility and introspection. This shift marked an innovation not in content, but in tone. Baghdad's philosophy entered an era of synthesis, moderation, and reflective balance, of philosophy shaped by the awareness of impermanence. Under this contemplative mood, the city's intellectual life felt both older and deeper, like a river moving slowly but carrying the weight of centuries. The calm before a distant storm. As the Seljuk Empire stabilized the region and Baghdad regained a measure of security, the city felt a strange duality, a peaceful surface over currents that flowed from far beyond the horizon. Caravans still crossed the deserts. Trade continued along the Silk Road. Scholars traveled from Persia, Syria, and Central Asia to study in Baghdad's madrasas and consult its libraries. But subtle signs hinted at changes yet to come. Travelers spoke of distant invasions in the farther steppes. Nomadic confederations shifted unpredictably. New powers stirred beyond Persia's eastern mountains, still far from Baghdad, but moving westward with slow, relentless certainty. For now, Baghdad remained luminous and resilient. Its evenings glowed with lamplight on the Tigris. Its teachers lectured in calm, measured tones. Its scribes copied manuscripts that would one day preserve the memory of this entire world. But history's wheel had begun to turn again. A quiet melancholy settled over the city, the sense that the horizon held both promise and an unnamed threat still too distant to define. Baghdad was entering its final century of brilliance, though no one yet realized that the winds in the east carried the early stirrings of a storm unlike any it had faced before. The Great Peace, before upheaval. Baghdad in the 12th century lived in a paradox calm on the surface, yet shadowed by shifting forces far beyond its walls. A framing truth defined this new phase. The final centuries of a civilization often feel deceptively stable. The stakes were temporal and fragile. Every institution still functioned. The markets thrived, the madrasas taught, the House of Wisdom continued its work. Travelers marveled at how the city retained its dignity, and rhythm boatmen chanting along the Tigris, scholars pacing beneath colonnades, merchants negotiating under awnings that flapped softly in the wind. Yet subtle tremors ran beneath the serenity. The Seljuk Empire, once the force that had restored order to Baghdad, began to fracture its rulers, divided its generals competing for territory, its administrative structure straining under internal disputes. Human agents revealed the fragility of this moment. Sanjar, last great Seljuk sultan, whose reign ended in disorder as rival factions weakened the unity he had long defended. Local governors, increasingly independent, prioritizing regional interests over loyalty to Baghdad. Merchant guilds, more protective of their own networks than of state directives, no longer enforced with conviction. And yet amid this quiet political decay, Baghdad's intellectual life remained astonishingly vibrant. The innovation of this era lay in its persistence. Baghdad maintained its scholarly traditions despite the weakening of the political world that had once nurtured them. But the winds were shifting, softly at first, like distant echoes of a world on the move. The last harvest of knowledge. In the House of Wisdom, where lamps burned long after sunset, and scholars continued their work as though time itself had no authority, a final flowering of intellectual activity took place. A clear framing. Truth governed this phase. The greatest intellectual harvests often occur when the garden is in its final season. The stakes were intellectual and archival. Scholars sensed, perhaps unconsciously, that they must preserve as much knowledge as possible for a future no one could predict. Human agents illuminated this last bloom. Ibn al-Jawzi, polymath and preacher, whose works blended morality, history, and psychological insight with extraordinary detail. Ibn al-Athir, whose historical chronicles captured the sweep of centuries with sober clarity. Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi, philosopher and physician, whose writings pushed beyond inherited concepts into original theories on motion and psychology. Copyists worked tirelessly inking manuscripts that would one day carry Baghdad's memory across continents. Translation continued, though, at a slower pace as scholars refined terminology and corrected earlier works with a maturity born of centuries of accumulated experience. The innovation of this period was introspective. Baghdad turned its vast knowledge inward, distilling, organizing, and preserving the intellectual identity it had shaped over 400 years. At times it seemed as though the city was preparing quietly, instinctively, for an age when the outside world would no longer protect what it had created. The spread of knowledge westward. As uncertainty crept across the eastern frontiers, the intellectual influence of Baghdad flowed increasingly toward the west. A framing truth guided this diffusion. Ideas survive by traveling farther than the empires that created them. The stakes were civilizational. Baghdad's decline would not mean the end of its wisdom if its books, teachers, and methods found new homes. Through Syria, Egypt, and North Africa, Baghdad's scientific texts spread along trade routes and scholarly networks. Human agents carried these treasures, Jewish scholars who translated Arabic philosophical works into Hebrew and Latin, Christian monks who traveled to the Middle East seeking medical treatises and mathematical texts. Andalusian scholars who brought Baghdad's intellectual tradition into Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo, where teams of translators rendered Arabic science into the languages of medieval Europe. In Toledo's schools, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy from Baghdad were studied by scholars who had never seen the Tigris, yet felt its imprint in every line of commentary. The innovation of this era was geographic. Baghdad's knowledge became global knowledge. Long after its political authority waned, its intellectual legacy continued to shape the mathematics, medicine, and philosophy of places far removed from its golden riverbanks. Baghdad, without realizing it, had already ensured its immortality. The first signs of the Eastern Storm. While Baghdad's influence expanded westward, a new power was rising in the east, not yet visible to most, but gaining strength with each passing year. A sobering framing truth soon asserted itself: the greatest dangers to a civilization often originate in lands it does not closely watch. The stakes were military and existential. Tribes displaced by climate change, economic pressure, and shifting alliances began to coalesce into larger confederations capable of tremendous mobility. Across the plains of Mongolia and the forests of Manchuria, new leaders emerged, strategists whose discipline, adaptability, and understanding of warfare would soon eclipse anything Baghdad had encountered. Human agents of this distant upheaval remained mostly unknown to Baghdad's scholars, yet their rise would one day reshape the world. Yasuge chieftain, whose influence would set the foundations for a greater power still emerging. The disparate tribes honing skills in archery, horsemanship, and fast-moving warfare. Small confederations beginning to unify under increasingly ambitious leaders. Travelers returning from Central Asia brought strange stories of relentless riders of villages emptied of new alliances forming with startling speed. But in Baghdad these tales felt distant, like rumors carried on the wind, easy to dismiss in a city still filled with the hum of scholarship and trade. The innovation of the Mongol rise lay in its methods, its mobility, its capacity to adapt qualities Baghdad had never confronted on such a scale. The storm was still gathering far beyond the horizon, but its first shadows had already touched the mapmaker's charts. A city unaware of its destiny. As the 13th century approached, Baghdad remained luminous, not with the fierce light of its early Golden Age, but with a gentle radiance shaped by memory continuity and a devotion to learning that no political turbulence had yet extinguished. The city felt timeless. Students still walked with scrolls tucked under their arms. Poets recited verses along the riverbank. Astronomers mapped the heavens from rooftops that had watched centuries unfold. Yet time, relentless and indifferent, tightened its grip. Baghdad sensed that the world was changing, but it could not yet see the full outline of what approached. For now the city breathed in peace, a fragile peace, the kind that precedes profound transformation. Its scholars continued their work, unaware that future generations would look back upon these years as the final calm before the arrival of a force that would alter the course of medieval history. The winds from the east hardened, the horizon darkened, and Baghdad, still wrapped in the gentle glow of learning, waited unknowingly for the century that would test everything it had built. The gathering thunder. The 13th century opened with a stillness that felt almost ceremonial, as though history paused to draw breath before exhaling a storm. A framing truth overshadowed this final act. Baghdad's fall did not begin. At its walls it began on horizons its scholars seldom studied. The stakes were global and irreversible. A world shaped for centuries by trade, scholarship and diplomacy was about to encounter a force unlike any it had known. Across the vast steppes to the northeast, a leader of extraordinary will welded scattered tribes into a single, relentless entity. His name would echo across continents: Temujin Genghis Khan. Human agents in this early Mongol world operated with precision and unity. Genghis Khan, whose strategic genius fused discipline with ruthless innovation. Subutai, a general capable of battles fought 1,000 miles apart. Jebe, whose reconnaissance skills mapped the vulnerabilities of ancient empires. Their armies moved like flowing metal, fast, coordinated, and terrifyingly adaptive. They struck not for plunder alone, but for total domination, dismantling kingdoms with speed that stunned the medieval world. As word of these conquests reached Persia and Transoxiana, traders carried warnings to Baghdad, their stories weighted with disbelief and fear. But Baghdad, wrapped in the dignity of centuries, could not yet conceive that the world itself was tilting toward a new center of power. The fall of Eastern defenses. The Mongol advance did not approach Baghdad directly. It consumed the lands beyond Persia, first unraveling the empire's protective outer shell layer by layer. A sobering truth shaped this encroachment. Baghdad was never meant to stand alone. The stakes were defensive and structural. For centuries, the caliphate depended on a chain of strong states to absorb the first shock of invasion. Now, one by one, those shields collapsed. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a formidable power stretching from the Aral Sea to the Persian Gulf, crumbled under the precision of Mongol strategy. Cities burned, fortresses emptied, armies defeated in battles that reshaped the defensive map of the Islamic world. Human agents attempted resistance. Jalal ad-Din, last Khwarezmian prince, fought with desperate bravery, yet failed to halt the Mongol tide. Local governors sought alliances, but found none strong enough to counter the rising force. Refugees carrying torn manuscripts and memories of devastation fled westward, bringing first-hand accounts of the destruction. As these survivors reached Baghdad's gates, their presence carried a truth the city could not ignore. The Mongols were not a distant myth, they were already close. Maps in Baghdad's libraries were revised yet again. Scholars now debated not philosophical subtleties, but the meaning of catastrophic change. The last flickers of institutions. Inside Baghdad. The institutions that had defined its greatness continued to function, but their vitality grew thin like the final embers of a long-burning fire. A framing truth shaped this phase. Even in decline, a great civilization continues to create, teach, and remember. The stakes were institutional and cultural. Baghdad still held the Nizamiya madrasas, its revered judges, its mathematicians, its historians, its physicians. But these institutions felt the tremors of approaching crisis. The Caliph al-Mustansir attempted renewal, establishing the Mustansiriya Madrasa, a vast, meticulously designed academy that united the major schools of law under one roof. Human agents carried forward the city's final intellectual efforts, Ibn al-Sa'ati refining astronomical tables even as the world shifted beneath him. Ibn al-Fawati, librarian and historian, cataloguing manuscripts that he feared might soon be lost. Physicians who continued to treat the poor in hospitals, funded by old endowments, maintaining dignity amid growing uncertainty. The innovation of this era lay not in new theories, but in continuity. Baghdad refused to abandon its scholarly soul, even as its political strength eroded around it. Yet even in its persistence, the city felt the pressure of isolation. Its allies faded, its borders shrank, its treasury thinned. The circle that had once symbolized unified power now felt fragile, a geometry stretched toward breaking. The miscalculation of the Caliph. As Mongol pressure intensified, Baghdad faced an excruciating choice: submit, negotiate, or resist. A tragic framing, truth emerged. Misjudgment at a single moment can alter the fate of a civilization. The stakes were existential. Diplomacy required humility and strategic foresight, qualities the Abbasid court, wrapped in centuries of prestige, struggled to embody. When a Mongol mission arrived with stern demands, the Caliph al-Mustasim responded with hesitation, mixed messages, and an underestimation of Mongol resolve. Human agents around him failed to unify their council. Viziers, uncertain and factional, disagreed on strategy. Militaries weakened by years of internal conflict exaggerated their readiness. Court elites accustomed to symbolic authority dismissed the Mongols as merely another nomadic threat. But the Mongols were not like earlier nomads. They were tacticians, calculators, masters of siege warfare, and relentless in pursuit of complete submission. The Caliph's indecision, his refusal to offer tribute, and his failure to fortify the city set Baghdad on a course from which it could not return. The Mongol leaders interpreted the Caliph's defiance as a challenge. Their response would redefine the medieval world. The siege that changed history. In the winter of 1258, the Mongol army led by Hulagu Khan approached Baghdad, a force described by survivors as vast, methodical, and terrifyingly calm. A grim framing truth now came into focus. Baghdad was facing not an army, but a new era. The stakes were absolute. The survival of the city's people, its libraries, its institutions, its centuries of accumulated memory. The Mongols encircled the city with chilling efficiency. Siege engines were assembled. The Tigris was cut off. Bridges were captured. Supply lines severed. Baghdad, whose walls once symbolized cosmic order, now became a fragile ring trapped between a brilliant past and a merciless present. Human agents shaped this final confrontation. Hulagu, disciplined and implacable, determined to make Baghdad an example. Mongol engineers, whose siege machines hurled stone and fire with devastating accuracy. Baghdadi defenders, courageous but outmatched, fighting from the ramparts with dwindling hope. After days of bombardment, the walls failed. The Mongols entered. What followed was a devastation recorded by chroniclers with trembling pens, the destruction of libraries, the burning of manuscripts, the loss of scholars who had preserved centuries of knowledge. The Tigris, it was said, ran dark with both ink and blood. And yet, even in this tragedy, something remarkable endured. The memory that could not be killed. Though Baghdad fell, its legacy did not. A quiet framing. Truth closes this chapter. Ideas outlive the cities that create them. The Mongols, despite their destruction, would later adopt the sciences and administrative systems of the Islamic world, becoming unexpected custodians of the knowledge they encountered. Survivors fled to Syria, Egypt, Anatolia, and beyond, carrying with them books, skills, and traditions that would shape the next stages of Islamic civilization. And Baghdad's influence, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, had already spread to Europe, India, and Central Asia. Human agents ensured the endurance of its soul. Scholars who escaped the siege preserved critical texts. Teachers rebuilt institutions in Damascus, Cairo, and Samarkand. Translators carried the intellectual DNA of Baghdad into the Renaissance. Thus, even as the city's walls fell, its ideas survived, woven into the fabric of world civilization. Baghdad's circle was broken, yet its light traveled outward, imprinted on the minds of generations who would never see the domes that once reflected the sun along the Tigris. The ashes and the dawn. In the weeks after the Mongol conquest, Baghdad lay silent, its markets empty, its gardens trampled, its libraries reduced to smoldering fragments of parchment. A framing truth defined this bleak beginning. Even in ruin, a great city leaves a resonance that cannot be extinguished. The stakes were cultural and existential. Would Baghdad vanish into memory, its knowledge scattered like ash, or would its surviving scholars carry forward the essence of everything the city had built? Smoke rose from the Tigris as winter winds swept through broken archways and collapsed halls. The House of Wisdom, that jewel of centuries, was now an open skeleton of walls standing against the sky. And yet survivors gathered. Scribes searched for intact manuscripts. Teachers set up makeshift classrooms beneath cracked colonnades where dust filtered through fractured ceilings. Human agents shaped the fragile renewal. Ibn al-Fawati, librarian, who returned to rescue catalogues and texts from debris that others dismissed as useless. Healers, tending the wounded with the same calm discipline their predecessors practiced for centuries. Students refusing to let the intellectual lineage of Baghdad end with their generation. What made this moment innovative was not the creation of new knowledge, but the refusal to let knowledge die. Baghdad began to rise again, not from power, but from memory. The dispersal of the Baghdad mind. The fall of Baghdad triggered one of the greatest intellectual migrations in the medieval world. A framing truth guided this exodus. When a center collapses, its fragments often form new constellations. The stakes were civilizational. If the surviving scholars could integrate into new cities, Baghdad's scientific and philosophical traditions would continue to shape the world. If not, centuries of innovation would dim irretrievably. From the ruins, waves of scholars traveled outward. Human agents carried Baghdad's legacy across continents. Mathematicians who settled in Damascus and Cairo, introducing refined algebraic methods that had matured in the last Abbasid centuries. Physicians who brought Baghdad's medical casebooks to hospitals in Aleppo, Konya, and Tabriz. Jurists and theologians who re-established legal teaching in new circles of scholarship. Poets and authors who carried stories, commentaries, and fragments of lost manuscripts into new literatures. The innovation of this dispersal was organic. Baghdad's intellectual DNA was woven into the cities that received its scholars, seeding a network of learning from Anatolia to Egypt to Persia. In time, these cities would rebuild scientific traditions that traced their lineage directly back to the Tigris. The memory in distant capitals, as Baghdad struggled to recover, other cities rose that carried its influence like a hidden current. A framing truth shaped this era of renewal. Baghdad lived on through the institutions that adopted its methods. The stakes were educational and cultural. Could the spirit of Baghdad's scholarship take root in new soil, or would it remain confined to the fragile memories of survivors? In Cairo, the Mamluks built schools and hospitals, modeled on Abbasid prototypes. In Damascus, scholars nurtured libraries that preserved Baghdad's works and expanded upon them. In Tabriz and Maraha, under the patronage of the Ilkhanid Mongols, new observatories emerged, direct heirs to Baghdad's scientific ambition. Human figures shaped this transmission. Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, philosopher and astronomer, built the Maraga Observatory atop Mongol patronage, using methods drawn from Baghdad to create models that would influence later Persian and even European astronomy. Ibn al-Nafis in Egypt wrote medical works that blended his own discoveries with the traditions of the Baghdad physicians. Historians who chronicled the rise and fall of cities, dynasties, and empires with the analytical tools refined in centuries of Iraqi scholarship. This diffusion revealed a remarkable innovation. The intellectual structure Baghdad had created proved portable, adaptable, and enduring. Cities changed, empires shifted, but the methods of learning and the reverence for knowledge remained intact. The echo in Europe. While Baghdad rebuilt slowly, its influence continued to shape a world it never saw. A framing truth illuminated this unexpected legacy. Baghdad's Golden Age was one of the silent architects of the European Renaissance. The stakes were global. Baghdad's mathematical, medical, and philosophical texts had crossed into Al-Andalus centuries earlier, then into Christian Spain, and from there into the universities of Italy and France. Human agents carried this quiet revolution forward. Gerard of Cremona, who translated Baghdad's scientific corpus into Latin, transforming European astronomy and medicine. Michael Scott, who brought Aristotelian commentaries refined in Baghdad's philosophical tradition into the courts of Sicily. Scholars of Bologna and Paris who absorbed algebraic methods born in the mind of al-Khwarizmi and matured by generations of Baghdadi mathematicians. The innovation of this transfer was intellectual lineage. Baghdad's logic, its scientific discipline, its methods of debate and scholarship became foundational to the emergence of modern science. Europe's libraries swelled with translated Arabic manuscripts. Its thinkers built upon Baghdad's centuries of inquiry. The city's fall had not severed its influence, it had accelerated its spread. The quiet rebirth along the Tigris. In the centuries after the Mongol conquest, Baghdad rebuilt slowly, not with the certainty of old, but with a humble resolve, shaped by the memory of what it once was. A framing truth defined this renewal. No city that has been the home of knowledge ever dies completely. The stakes were generational. Could Baghdad find new purpose after losing its political and intellectual supremacy? Could it become again a place where ideas grew? Reconstruction took decades. Canals were cleared, markets reopened, mosques were repaired. New academies appeared, smaller than the old ones, yet luminous with dedication. Human agents nurtured this revival. Teachers who began again with small groups of students under porticos and shaded gardens. Scribes who copied surviving manuscripts with renewed urgency. Local rulers, Mongol and later Turkic, who realized that stability required the restoration of civic and intellectual life. Baghdad never regained the brilliance of its golden age, yet it reclaimed something equally enduring: continuity, the quiet persistence of a city that knew its value lay not in empire but in memory, the legacy that lives in time. As centuries passed, Baghdad's golden age became a story told across continents, a tale of scholars, architects, astronomers, philosophers, poets and physicians who shaped the medieval world with ink and reason, a final framing. Truth brings this saga to its close. Baghdad's greatest achievement was not its empire but its mind. The stakes were universal. What survives of a civilization is not its walls or its rulers, but the ideas it leaves behind. Baghdad's legacy endures in modern mathematics, medical practice, philosophical inquiry, astronomy, architecture, and the very concept of the university as a structured community of learning. Its golden age remains one of the most extraordinary intellectual flowerings in human history. The city of everlasting dawn. And so as the Tigris flows beneath bridges old and new, and as the sun rises over the same horizon that scholars once watched millennia ago, the memory of Baghdad glows softly in the world, not as a vanished marvel, but as a source whose light continues to travel. Its circle was broken, its walls fell, its institutions scattered, yet its wisdom never abandoned humanity. Baghdad's golden age lives on in every library, every observatory, every hospital, every classroom where the pursuit of knowledge is treated as a form of devotion. That is the true afterlife of the city, a dawn that never fully fades, a light carried forward by all who seek understanding. Baghdad, city of scholars and shadows, rose, flourished and transformed the world. And though its golden age ended, its brilliance endures wherever the human mind reaches toward truth.